Hello, this is Rabbi David Abramson. Without saying another word, I'm sure you can guess what my topic today is. Though I am recording this video before Pesach, you will be seeing it during Pesach. And so I'd like to explore with you one of the central areas of Pesach observance. Our exploration begins with Moses Maimonides' introduction to the laws of Pesach. Maimonides begins his introduction, Hilchot Chametz Umatzah, Yesh Bichlalan Shmona Mitzvot. The laws concerning Chametz, leavened bread, and Matzah, unleavened bread, involved 8 mitzvot. Shalosh mitzvot aseh, 3 positive mitzvot that we fulfill by doing something, v'chamesh mitzvot lo ta'aseh, and 5 negative mitzvot that we fulfill by refraining from certain activities. So here, according to Maimonides, are the 8 mitzvot of Pesach. Number 1, not to eat chametz from noon onward on the 14th of Nisan. What is chametz? Although we often translate chametz as leavened bread, in fact, chametz is anything made with any of 5 species of grain which has been allowed to rise. And so all of the familiar baked goods that we eat all year round are not permitted to us on Pesach. That includes any kind of leavened bread and cakes and pies and cookies and so on. So the prohibition on eating chametz begins in the middle of the day before Pesach begins. Number 2, to put away chametz on the 14th of Nisan. Number 3, to not eat chametz throughout the 7 days of Pesach. Of course, in the diaspora, we traditionally observe Pesach for 8 days. Number 4, not to eat food with ta'arovet chametz, any admixture of chametz throughout the days of Pesach. So it's not only cookies and cakes and breads and so on that are made, for example, from wheat flour, but other things that are made from grains. For example, most whiskeys are not kosher for Pesach. Number 5, no chametz is to be seen in our homes throughout the days of the holiday. Number 6, no chametz is to be found in our homes throughout the days of the holiday. What's the distinction between chametz not being seen and chametz not being found? We'll get to at least one answer to that question. Number 7, to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach. To eat matzah at the Seder. In the diaspora, we traditionally have 2 sedarim, and so it is a mitzvah to eat matzah at the first Seder and to eat matzah at the second Seder. If you really don't like matzah, you're not really required to eat matzah throughout the whole week of Pesach. It's just that you're not allowed to eat any other kind of bread. If you want to eat bread, if you want to make a motzi, the beginning of a meal, it's got to be over matzah throughout the days of Pesach. But the obligation to eat matzah applies only at the first Seder and the second Seder. And finally, the 8th mitzvah of Pesach is to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt on that same night. And of course, we fulfilled that mitzvah traditionally at the first Seder and at the second Seder. So those are the mitzvot of Pesach. And did you notice something? 6 of the 8 mitzvot have to do with not eating chametz on Pesach. Pesach has always been one of my favorite holidays. Despite all the preparations, despite all the work in the days before Pesach, the themes of Pesach, the family focus on Pesach, interrupted in these days of COVID isolation, but nevertheless the traditional emphasis on family and friends gathering for Pesach, these are among the reasons that Pesach is one of my favorite holidays. And although I do have some favorite foods associated with Pesach, I don't eat a lot of matzah ball soup throughout the year. On Pesach, that's something that I certainly look forward to. But despite certain foods that I associate with Pesach that I particularly like, Pesach is one of my favorite holidays, despite the fact that the food restrictions, the prohibition on eating chametz, and anything with any even infinitesimal chametz ingredients, that can be rather burdensome for many Jews. When I was younger, during the waning hours of the last day of Pesach, I could hardly wait for the sun to set and for 3 stars to be visible in the sky, because then I could shoot out to the grocery store or shoot out to a restaurant to get my chametz fix. Because after 8 days of not eating chametz, I really needed to eat chametz. In recent years, I must admit that I don't go crazy with chametz withdrawal symptoms in the waning days of Pesach. But I must admit that by the time the festival is over, I'm happy to return to an easier way of eating and enjoying eating, because for the rest of the year, we, of course, are allowed to eat chametz. But the prohibition of chametz is, as you see in Maimonides' list, is so significant, is so major. And so that's why I'd like to explore with you not the details of Pesach observance, not the question of what constitutes chametz and what doesn't, and whether the additional prohibition of eating kitniot should or should not apply in contemporary times. I want to put all those questions on the side and concentrate on the central question: why should we avoid chametz? I mean, beyond the fact that the Torah explicitly commands us to avoid chametz in all the details that we saw in this list of mitzvot. So let's jump in. Let's begin our deeper exploration of why we avoid chametz on Pesach. Religions in general, and Judaism, my religious tradition in particular, revels in symbolism. Our stories, our biblical stories, our rabbinic midrashim and legends and so on abound in symbols, and our rituals also are full of symbols, at least if we dig enough trying to find the symbolic explanations for these or those traditions, these or those laws, these or those observances. And so our exploration of the significance of avoiding chametz on Pesach will concentrate, as you'll see, on the lessons that different symbolisms can teach us. So here's our first symbolic explanation. It comes from a medieval source called Sefer HaChinuch. The name literally means the Book of Education. This is a book whose author is unknown to us, that lists and tries to explain each of the 613 mitzvot. And so this is the explanation of Sefer HaChinuch for why we avoid chametz on Pesach. The avoidance of chametz, the avoidance of leavening, which occurs as a result of great delay. Those of you who have more experience in bread baking than I do, but even I, who used to bake challah from time to time back in my youth, know that bread baking involves a lot of time. You make the dough, you knead the dough, and then you let it rise. And then you knead it some more, and you let it rise some more. And depending on the kind of bread you're making, there may be a lot of time involved in allowing the dough to rise. Well, as Sefer HaChinuch explains, the avoidance of leavening, which occurs as a result of a great delay, emphasizes the centrality of eagerness, alacrity, and enthusiastic haste at the service of God. May God be praised. As the sages of blessed memory said, and now Sefer HaChinuch is quoting the Talmud, "Be bold like a leopard, light like an eagle, run like a deer, and be strong like a lion to perform the will of your Father in heaven." Unlike bread, unlike chametz, which takes its time rising, and which generally takes a long time to rise, we shouldn't take our time doing mitzvot. When we have the opportunity to do a mitzvah, we should rush to do it. And that's the lesson of avoiding chametz. Don't approach mitzvot with casualness, slowly, languorously, and so on. Rush to do a mitzvah. And that's why we avoid chametz for this week-long festival, to teach us the lesson of not delaying, not taking our time, but rather enthusiastically rushing to do mitzvot. The next explanation comes from the Zohar, the foundational document of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. This passage in the Zohar begins by observing that Exodus chapter 34, verse 17 says, Elohei masecha lo ta'aseh lach. You shall not make molten gods for yourselves. This is one of the Torah's many prohibitions on making idols and worshiping idols. But then in the next verse, in verse 18, the Torah says, Et chag hamatzot tishmor. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. One of the central principles of rabbinic interpretation is the notion that God, as the biblical author, was not a sloppy writer and was not a sloppy editor. And so if we find two biblical verses in a row that at first glance seem to be speaking of unrelated subjects, the proximity of one verse to the other is there to teach us that it's not coincidental that there's a connection between the two. So again, verse 17 said, you shall not make molten gods for yourself. And verse 18 said, you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. And so the Zohar asks, my hai, legabe hai, what does this have to do with that? What does the prohibition of making idols have to do with observing Chag Hamatzot, the feast of unleavened bread? The Zohar tells us this is the explanation. One who eats chametz on Pesach is like one who worships idols. That's really quite a striking statement. The Zohar, in observing the proximity and observing the connection between these two verses, suggests to us that the lesson is that eating chametz on Pesach is similar to worshiping idols. What is idol worship in the biblical mindset and in the rabbinic mindset? Idol worship is a refutation of monotheism, a refutation of faith in the one true God. Just about the worst thing that the ancient Israelites could do was to worship other gods. And so the Zohar asserts that by violating the prohibition on Pesach, we would be like somebody who was so faithless to Jewish tradition that they were worshiping other gods. The next explanation is based on a reading of Leviticus chapter 2, verse 11. So let's first take a look at the verse itself. Kol hamincha asher takrivu ladonai lo te'aseh chametz. No meal offering that you offer to Adonai shall be made with chametz, shall be made with leaven. Ki chol se'or v'chol devash lo taktiru imenu ishe ladonai. For no se'or, which is another biblical name for leaven, or honey may be turned into smoke as an offering by fire to Adonai. Remember that in ancient Judaism, sacrifices were a central part of our relating to God. There were sacrifices given every day, special ones for Shabbat, special ones for this holiday and that holiday, special ones for this circumstance and that circumstance. And so here the Torah is telling us that no isha can involve se'or, leaven, or honey. Now let's see how a medieval German rabbi by the name of Yaakov ben Asher interprets this verse. Lo te'aseh chametz, he writes, quoting the verse, shall not be made with chametz. And he explains, lefi sheyetzer hara domeh la se'or, because the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, is like leaven. Umitam zeh, gam ken he's here al hadavash, For the same reason, the Torah warns against honey, sheyetzer hara matok la'adam kidvash. For the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, is sweet to a person like honey. Why do we do wrong things sometimes? Why do we fail to do right things sometimes? One of the explanations of the rabbis is that each of us has two yitzarim, two inclinations, the yetzer hatov and the yetzer hara, the good inclination and the evil inclination. And when we follow our yetzer hara, our evil inclination, too much, we end up doing the wrong thing. And so both chametz and honey are prohibited in the context of biblical sacrifices. Why? Because chametz and honey are both associated with the evil inclination. And so during the week of Pesach, we avoid all chametz to try to teach ourselves the lesson that we should distance ourselves as much as reasonably possible, not only from chametz, but also from what chametz symbolizes, namely the yetzer hara. We avoid chametz to remind ourselves of the lesson of distancing ourselves from our evil inclinations. And now we come to a second explanation that equates chametz with the yetzer hara. Rabbi Alexandrai Batar Damatzlei Amar Hachi. Rabbi Alexandre, after finishing his prayers, used to say the following meditation. Ribon ha'olami, master of the universe, galui v'yadua lifanecha, it is revealed and known before you, sheritzonenu la'asot ritzonecha, that our desire is to do your will. Umam akev, what is it that prevents us from doing your will? Se'ur sheba'isa, the leaven in the dough. What does that mean? Leaven in the dough prevents us from doing God's will? Well, fortunately, we have Rashi, the classical commentator to the Talmud, to explain. And Rashi explains, what does Se'or Sheba'isa, what does leaven in the dough mean in Rabbi Alexandri's prayer? It means Yetzer Hara Shebilvavenu Hamachmitzenu. It is the evil inclination in our hearts which puffs us up. It's the symbolic chametz in our hearts that puff us up with pride, with arrogance, with complacency. That's what leads us in the wrong direction. The symbolic chametz in our souls is what leads us to do the wrong thing sometimes. And so by avoiding chametz during the week of Pesach, we're really trying to learn the lesson to distance ourselves from our yetzer hara, from our evil inclination. Our last explanation is our longest explanation. It comes from a wonderful source. It comes from the pen of a rabbi named Bachya ben Asher, who lived in Spain in the 13th and 14th century and wrote a wonderful book called Kad HaKemach. And here's his long and complicated explanation for the symbolic importance of avoiding chametz. And as the title on this page indicates, chametz is related to all mitzvot. And so Bachya begins his exploration by restating two prohibitions. And remember when we saw the list of the 8 mitzvot of Pesach in Maimonides' introduction, we saw that there were 2 prohibitions that at first glance appeared to be saying more or less the same thing. Lo yera'eh, chametz shall not be seen in your homes on Pesach, and lo yimatzeh, se'or shall not be found in your homes on Pesach. At first glance, these 2 prohibitions seem to be identical. But let's see what Rabbeinu Bachya does with these 2 phrases. Lo yera'eh b'ma'aseh. it shall not be seen refers to action. V'lo yimatzeh b'machashava, and it shall not be found refers to thoughts. Ella sheyevatalenu balev. Rather, one should annul it in one's heart. Rabbeinu Bachya goes on, the mitzvot have three categories: mitzvot of speech and of heart and of action. Kamo shekatuv, as it is written, and here Bachya is quoting Deuteronomy chapter 30, V'ficha uvilvavacha la'asoto, in your mouth and in your heart to observe it. Rabbeinu Bachya goes on, comes the Torah instructing us to annul it in the heart, corresponding to the mitzvot that are dependent on the heart. Comes the Kabbalah instructing us to eradicate it from the house or to burn it, corresponding to the mitzvot of action. Vilomar kol chamira keneged mitzvot hapeh, and saying kol chamira corresponding to the mitzvot of speech. Now we're going to have to take a little time unpacking those. Let's go back to line 7 in this text. Bachya quoted that passage in Deuteronomy, the Torah is in your mouth and in your heart to observe it. There are three words, beficha, in your mouth, uvilvavacha, and in your heart, la'asoto, to observe it. Some mitzvot are dependent on the heart, on our feelings. We fulfill some mitzvot by trying to feel this way or not feel that way. And that includes, for example, the prohibition on bearing a grudge, or the obligation, ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Line 9, some mitzvot we observe through behavior. And so getting rid of chametz, burning some of the chametz on the day before Pesach, that corresponds to the mitzvot of actions. And of course, most of our mitzvot are fulfilled behaviorally by doing this or that, or by refraining from this or that. Line 10, saying kol chamira, that corresponds to the mitzvot of speech. What is kol chamira? Those are the first two words of a lengthy statement that we traditionally make late on the morning before Pesach begins. With this verbal declaration, we affirm that any chametz that we didn't get rid of, that we forgot to get rid of, that we didn't notice as we were getting rid of the chametz, any chametz that we've overlooked, we now declare to be ownerless and like the dust of the earth. So this verbal declaration, nullifying our ownership of chametz, is also part of our preparation for Pesach. It's also part of our observing the prohibition of owning chametz during Pesach. This ritual is performed verbally by making this verbal declaration. And of course, there are mitzvot that we fulfill or that we violate through words. For example, the biblical prohibition on gossip. We can do good things with our words, and we can commit averot, violations of biblical prohibitions, with our words as well. And so Bachya continues, in this way, the three categories of mitzvot are fulfilled through the prohibition of chametz, teaching you that the prohibition of chametz incorporates all the mitzvot. Being careful about the chametz prohibitions may have the effect of enhancing our commitment to all the mitzvot when we see this particular mitzvah as connected to all the mitzvot in our tradition. And now let's see how Bachya continues here in line 13. Just as the Kabbalah comes instructing us to eradicate chametz and to check the house in nooks and in cracks, and indeed in many, many families, extensive efforts are expended to find any remaining chametz in the house during the days before Pesach. But there's a moral lesson in this. Just as we go to all of that trouble to search in all the nooks and cracks of our homes to find any literal chametz, line 14, so too we are obligated to search and check the chambers of our inner being for bad intentions and bad thoughts. So during the days before Pesach, when we're going to a lot of trouble to search, to find, and to get rid of the chametz in our kitchens and our dining rooms and so on, one of the lessons of all of that is to remind us of our obligation to search and check the chambers of our inner being for the metaphorical chametz inside us. Line 15. Just as bedikat chametz, searching for chametz, is not valid by sunlight, nor by moonlight, nor by the light of a torch, but only by the light of a candle, what Bachya is referring to here is the ritual of searching for chametz on the night before Pesach begins, the night before the first Seder. It's a charming and somewhat exotic ritual because we search for chametz by the light of a candle. And so Bachya reminds us, the dikat chametz, this ritual searching for chametz, is not valid by sunlight or by moonlight or by the light of a torch, but only by the light of a candle. Line 16. So too the search for the Yetzer Hara must be by the light of the soul, which is called candle. As the book of Proverbs tells us, Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, the lamp of Adonai is the soul of humanity. Let's scroll down to the footnotes to read the entire verse from Proverbs. Ner Adonai Nishmat Adam, the lamp of Adonai is the soul of humanity. Chofes kol chadrei vaten, which searches the chambers of one's inner being. The lamp of Adonai, which the rabbis interpret as the light of Torah, can illuminate our souls as we look in our souls for the metaphorical chametz that we should be trying to get rid of. So what have we learned about chametz? We saw first from the pen of Maimonides that 6 of the 8 mitzvot of Pesach involve the prohibition of chametz. But this prohibition should not only be obeyed, it should also teach us lessons. And so our exploration of chametz has revealed a number of symbolic explanations that have important lessons to teach. We learn from Sefer HaChinuch that chametz is associated with slow, languorous activity, the opposite of what should be our approach to the mitzvot, namely the eagerness and enthusiasm with which we should rush to fulfill mitzvot. The Zohar taught us that chametz is associated with the sin of idolatry. Yaakov ben Asher and Rabbi Alexandre in the Talmud taught us that chametz is associated with the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that when left unchecked can lead us to wrong decisions and wrong behaviors. Bachya ben Asher taught us through a complicated explanation that the prohibition of chametz can be seen as a lesson regarding the 3 categories of mitzvot, those that involve the heart, those that involve our words, and those that involve our behavior. My teacher, Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg, of blessed memory, used to ask, if you do a mitzvah and it doesn't affect your neshama, it doesn't affect your soul, then why do you do the mitzvah? When it comes to Pesach observance, and especially when it comes to all of the complicated details of avoiding chametz, it's very easy to simply go through the motions, to pay too little attention to the impact that this observance should be having on our neshamas, on our souls. Our exploration of chametz, and beyond that, our adherence to these rules throughout the week of Pesach, can remind us of the impact that these mitzvot should have on our souls, indeed, the impact that all of the mitzvot should have on our souls. Chag Kasher v'Sameach, May you continue to have a kosher and happy and meaningful holiday.